Hi, everybody. My name is Linda Lee, and I am a board member for Colorado Field Ornithologists. So thrilled that you could join us on this presentation on Pinyon Jays, the Pinyon Jay Community Science Project. And now I want to introduce John Boone and Ned Bohman. And let me just read their bios. So John Boone joined the Great Basin Bird Observatory in 2006 and has been involved, go back to my notes here, and has been involved with many of its flagship projects, including a breeding bird atlas, a state bird conservation plan, and the initiation of its earliest Pinyon Jay studies in 2008. He has played a major role in helping to create the products developed by the Pinyon Jay Working Group, including the Pinyon Jay Conservation Strategy and the Pinyon Jay Landscape Level Survey Protocol. He also administers the National Pinyon Jay Community Science Effort. John received his undergrad degree from George Washington University and his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. After graduate school, he spent 10 years at the University of Reno as a research faculty member before shifting to the Bird Observatory. Now, for Ned, Ned has been with the Great Basin Bird Observatory since 2015. He has spent most of that time conducting year-round field work in the Great Basin and Mojave Deserts. Before coming to Nevada, Ned graduated from the University of Vermont in 2012 with a Bachelor of Science. After graduating, he worked on seasonal research positions with various species of birds, as well as desert tortoises and king cobras. He transitioned into his current role as outreach coordinator in 2022 and currently focuses on connecting the public with the research conducted by the Great Basin Bird Observatory. He also serves as the secretary of the Nevada Bird Records Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Ned. Welcome.
Okay, I think I unmuted myself successfully. Thank you, Linda. Thank you for having us tonight. Thank you, everyone at CFO, for asking for this presentation. Thrilled to be here talking with you all about Pinyon Jays, some of my favorite birds. So I will be, I'll be talking about sort of the history of the effort thus far and a little bit of natural history and conservation concerns about the Pinyon Jay. And then I'll hand it over to John afterwards. But first, I just want to introduce the Great Basin Bird Observatory a little bit. We are a nonprofit research organization based in Reno, Nevada. We were formed in 1997 for the Breeding Bird Atlas that John referenced in his bio. And since that time, that atlas was completed in the early 2000s. And since that time, we've continued monitoring birds throughout the state of Nevada. And we have current research, monitoring, and consulting projects throughout the state and surrounding areas as well, a bit into Eastern California and Arizona. We offer various professional skill development workshops, including professional survey training for the Pinyon Jay survey protocols developed by the Partners in Flight Working Group, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. Community events, and we really value diverse partnerships to accomplish all of this. None of our work would be possible without the partners that we work with. And so we really appreciate their support and investment in all of our work. And I already ran through this a little bit, but basically here's what to expect through tonight. I'll be talking about the first bit, and then when we get to current research and updates in progress, I will hand it over to John. So with that said, let's jump into it. We are here to talk about Pinyon Jays, which are probably a familiar bird to a lot of you at this point. I know, I actually don't know how much of our audience is current volunteers and how many are new volunteers. So hopefully that I will strike a balance with this information and it will be valuable to all of you. But a quick overview of Pinyon Jays before I get into more details about their natural history. They are a flocking corvid. They're well known for the large flocks that they form and are commonly seen in the hundreds of individuals. They're also very well known for their specialized relationship with the pinyon pine, and it's one of classic mutualism where the bird functions as a seed disperser for the plant, gains nutrition from that, and the plant spreads its seed benefiting from the bird. They also have a very large home range size, much larger than any other songbird in our area. And they have very habitat specific behaviors. So while they occupy pinyon juniper woodlands, that's a very dynamic habitat, and they use it differently for different aspects of their life history. They have complex movements throughout the year and throughout the day. There are likely patterns to all of these movements that are happening on a bigger scale than we can sometimes understand. And because of all of this, they pose unique challenges for research and monitoring. So in a nutshell, that's what we're dealing with. And I will get into a little more detail now. So again, probably familiar to most people in the audience. They're a uniform blue-gray coloration, same on the top and bottom, left, right side, all that uniform powder blue. They're about the size of a robin, and they have long bill, short tail, long wings, and this compact structure, this chunky body with a short tail, long, powerful wings, and a long, powerful bill. Both sexes look alike, with mature males averaging more blue on the face, but there's no definitive criteria for sexing the birds in the field. Juveniles, fledglings, immatures are grayish overall, and they get bluer as they become more mature. And again, most of you know what they look like, but just at a few different angles. You don't always see them very well, which is why I always include this bit about ID, because if you do see them well, they're not hard to identify, but often you don't see them well. So paying attention to those structural characters, the long wings, bill, and the short tail, are very useful. And then again, just a couple of slides to compare them with some potentially similar species seen in similar areas. Again, if seen well, there is no cause for confusion here, but often you don't see them well, and mountain bluebirds are a flocking bird, and you often do see them in large groups. I don't think I've seen groups of hundreds of mountain bluebirds, but dozens certainly, and you don't always see the full flock of pinyon jays when you do see them. So at a distance, again, look for the structure of the bird, that long bill and the shorter tail with that chunky kind of compact body. Larger overall size as well, although distance can be a factor in determining that as well. Scrub jays are another potential cause for concern. The bird there in the photo is a California scrub jay. I know that is not the species you guys have in Colorado. But the points to separate them are pretty much the same as with woodhouses. We're looking at the structure of the bird. The scrub jay is going to have a long tail, excuse me, long tail, short bill. Pinyon jay is the opposite with a short bill, short tail, long bill. The uniform coloration, if seen well, but sometimes you're just seeing these birds from the back or perched distantly on a tree, so we're having to rely more on these structural characters. So again, you can see that much longer bill on the pinyon jay, shorter on the scrub jay, longer tail on the scrub jay, shorter tail on the pinyon jay. And worth noting with all of these structural field marks, paying attention to the effect that the bird's posture might have on your perception of these field marks, whether it's turning its head to the side, if it's facing you, you can misjudge the size of the bill depending on some of those things. And again, in flight, the silhouette, you'll see that long wing, long bill, short tail stands out distinctly from these other potential confusion species. That's the pinyon jay in the top center, mountain bluebird at the lower left, and then the scrub jay on the lower right. And again, that much bigger head on the pinyon jay compared to the mountain bluebird. Otherwise, kind of similar in structure. And I'm not sure if these sounds will work. Again, it's probably nothing that you guys haven't heard before, those of you that are familiar with the species. I have a number of typical calls, and then the last recording are sort of atypical calls, typically only heard during courtship and the breeding season. So I will go through these, and hopefully you all can hear them. And those are their typical rack calls. There were a few near calls in there, or caw calls, and I think this next recording has a few of those as well, but they have been shown to recognize individuals based on those caw calls, not the rack calls. Those are different. And so here we'll show this one. And so you could hear a few different call types in there. The rack calls serve as alarm calls and distress calls, and those caw or near calls that waver at the end rather than the rack calls that have a harsher ending. Those are the ones they use to recognize each other and communicate with their mates. And those rack calls grade into excited series that warn the flock of approaching danger. And that sounds like this. So very shrill and insistent. Those calls have more abrupt endings than those wavering near calls that I was playing initially. And those are their distress calls and alarm calls. And interestingly enough, a lot of the vocalizations and recordings you can find online are of that particular vocalization. And I have a theory that it's related to the presence of the recorder, and the birds are responding to him. And that's why we have so many recordings of that particular vocalization. But this last vocalization is given by females only, and only when hormones are high during the breeding season. And it sounds like this. And those are rattles, and they grade into each other as well. Those also have more excited and less excited versions. That was sort of the standard version that I was playing, and that was in response to a male bringing food to the female. And there was a churr call in there as well that sounds like something an acorn woodpecker makes, and that is another call given by the female to welcome the male's advances. So all of this to say that they have a very diverse array of vocalizations, but you will mainly hear two vocalizations, and they have specific functions. So being aware of those functions is useful when you're out there, because if you are disturbing the birds, it is good to know that, and you can then back off to not disturb the birds. Oh boy, okay, here we go. So the range of the Pinyon Jay from two different sources here. We have Birds of the World, eBird Cornell data on the left, and then Breeding Birds Survey data on the right, which has a little bit of an abundance to it. So you can see that the most of the population is sort of in central Nevada and northern New Mexico. Between those two places, there's more than, well, most of the population is between those two places. I won't hazard a guess to the proportions. But that's where the bird is found throughout the Intermountain West, and it mostly matches the distribution of the pinyon pine, which I will get to. I will circle back on that in a few slides. But the social history is one of the coolest things about the Pinyon Jay. They have these massive flocks that are sort of variable in size throughout the year. And it's not necessarily that it's based on what they're up to. So that photo in the background there is actually taken by a volunteer in soon to be new volunteer from Carson City. And actually had some volunteers, current volunteers, estimate how many birds there were in that photo. And we got a minimum of 1,275. And that was taken about a month ago in Carson City. And so in the wintertime, the flocks are at their largest, and that's because they are retrieving caches, and that is potentially done more effectively as a group using each other's knowledge for that. But then as the winter goes on, we get into spring, the flock breaks up a little bit, and you see smaller flocks in the spring and summer because the birds are tending to their immediate families. And then the flocks will start to coalesce again in the fall when the young fledge, and you'll have these large winter flocks. So in that way, it kind of fluctuates throughout the year. But the family is the building block of the flock. So flocks are composed of families of pinyon jays. They're capable of recognizing each other, and the young males often help their parents raise the brood the following year. So there's a cooperative breeding element to a lot of flocks. And they are also communal nesters and roosters. So they basically do everything as a group, and the size of this group varies throughout the year based on what they're up to. I mentioned their diet is they have this classic mutualist relationship with the pinyon pine, and their diet is almost exclusively pinyon pine nuts. They will eat invertebrates, grasshoppers, beetles, moths, butterflies, that kind of thing in the springtime as they become available. And they will also supplement their diet with nuts from other pines, seeds from bird feeders, juniper berries to a certain degree as well. And that's sort of the typical model of a Pinyon Jay diet. But if we circle back to the range maps here, we will notice that the range of the Pinyon Jay goes north of the range of the pinyon pine, and the range of the pinyon pine does go south of the range of the bird. But what's going on where there are pinyon jays and there are not pinyon pines is sort of an interesting and open question. We don't know their primary food source in these areas. We know they're using ponderosa and juniper woodlands, but exactly what they're getting all of their sustenance from is still not totally clear. And because of this adaptation with pine nuts, they have a number of physical adaptations to eat pine nuts as well. You can argue that every aspect of their biology is a behavioral adaptation to this, but in terms of their physical structure, they have a number of features that make them very well suited to forage on pinyon pine nuts. And that long sturdy bill, obviously like a chisel to get into the cones, that is very useful for getting the nuts out. They have no feathers at the base of their bill. Their genus name is actually Gymnorhinus, meaning naked nose. So they have no feathers at the base of their bill. This is useful when pinyon pine cones are ripening. They are covered with gooey, sticky resin, and this poses problems for a lot of wildlife species that are interested in eating the nuts. However, the pinyon jays have a little bit of a leg up on competitors in this regard, in that they can get in there when the cones are covered in resin and their bill doesn't get all gummed up with the feathers that they don't have at the base of it. They also have a specialized musculature in the jaw so that articulates in a specific way that enables them to more better access cones, or sorry, access nuts within cones. And they have a modified crop that can hold up to 50 pine nuts. So that bird in the photo is carrying an entire cone from a tree that is early in the season when the cones are covered in this pitchy resin and they're closed up tight. So the birds actually have to hammer them open on a perch. Later on in the season, they can get the individual nuts from the cone without removing the entire cone from the tree. So this is early in the harvest season that photo was taken. And in addition to the adaptations in their beak and their jaws, the structure of their body is in itself an adaptation for this. They have long wings, and their large body size makes them a pretty powerful flyer and a capable mover. And this is potentially a response to the patchy distribution of this habitat on the landscape, as well as the irregular production of nuts from year to year, because pinyon pine is a masting species, which is an important point to make in this discussion of diet, that the pinyon pine produces inconsistent amounts of nuts from year to year. So there are different amounts of food resources available to the birds from year to year. And because their primary food resource is produced in such abundance in the fall, they have developed these caching behaviors where they harvest as many nuts as they possibly can as they become ripe in the late summer and fall, and they cache them for use throughout the winter. And if I had to hazard a guess at the birds in that photo there, I would bet those are birds at a feeder. I have not seen birds caching in such close proximity to each other in other situations. I've got a photo and several slides that shows more what I typically see of birds caching. Looks like these birds are gathering seed off the ground, but hard to say for sure. The point being with this caching behavior is that this is sort of what makes them the most important thing about their biology. It's sort of what makes them tick. It's what makes them pinyon jays. It drives most of their behavior throughout the rest of the year. And so we mentioned the mutualist relationship where they disperse seeds that become new habitat for themselves. And then the caches that they do eat, they are their winter food supply. They are scatter hoarders, so they typically put one nut per hole, and these are scattered across the landscape compared to something like a squirrel or an acorn woodpecker, for example, that puts all of their nuts in one location. Pinyon jays have distinct areas of their home range that serve as the caching areas. And it's not necessarily one area, although maybe for some flocks it is just one area, but for some flocks it is certainly multiple areas of the home range that serve as caching areas. And with these caching areas, they are typically avoiding higher elevation sites, and they're caching in areas that are not going to be buried with snow in the winter. So we see a lot of south facing, low slope, low density coverage of shrubs, sandy substrate, that kind of thing for caching habitat. And their sort of quote unquote annual cycle, or the phenology of their life history, is very closely linked to that of the pinyon pine. That's why I was saying previously that the availability of nuts really drives their behavior throughout the rest of the year. So the nuts that ripen in the late summer initiate the harvesting and caching period from late summer through fall, and then they coalesce into these large flocks with all of the fledglings and potentially neighboring flocks, and they subsist off of these caches until the spring. Pine nuts don't last much more than a year underground before they rot and become no longer viable. So this is not necessarily a strategy to deal with low production years, but it is a strategy to get them through the winter. And then by March, when their caches are running low, insects are starting to become available on the landscape, temperatures are warming up, and that leads to their nesting and reproduction stage, which again, they start earlier and get a leg up on potential competitors by doing so. So variable based on latitude and weather, and most of my experience is based here in Nevada in the Great Basin, though I suspect it's pretty similar across most of their range, just with a little bit of variability based on severe weather. So courtship typically begins in the winter. You can start hearing those rattle calls as early as December. And then the large flocks will start breaking up. The pairs that do typically mate for life, they start strengthening their bond with each other. And those courtship calls are all part of those rituals. Then they start building their nests, which are usually completed by the end of the winter. And in that way, the eggs are hatching in early spring, and the nestlings are fledging before most other species are nesting. And so the pinyon jay fledglings have open access to all of the insect resources on the landscape before most other songbirds are using those for their own fledglings. I mentioned in my first slide that they were colonial and cooperative breeders. So the photo on the right is an example of what a colony might look like. And this is different from flock to flock, different based on what they have available on their home range, but that spacing is pretty consistent. The birds are typically not putting more than one nest in a single tree, but they're often nesting in adjacent trees. But sometimes the nest can be as far as 100 meters apart, or even more in some cases. So they're variably sized and spaced colonies, but they're often in areas of slightly denser cover and possibly slightly higher slopes. But that photo shows an example of the spacing. And then the photo on the left shows what the nests look like. They're these pretty large, messy stick nests. They can be maybe a foot across and almost as deep. So it's a bit bigger than you might expect for a bird the size of a pinyon jay. And they are cooperative breeders. In some cases, perhaps not in all cases, but at least in some flocks studied, the young males will help their parents provision the young of the following year. Just another example of what the nests look like. Both of those are Pinyon Jay nests, and you can see a tiny bit of bird in the photo on the right there, if you look very closely. But they typically pick the most concealed part of the tree to place their nests. So not necessarily always against the trunk, but excuse me, again, if the tree is structured that way where most cover is around the trunk, that's where they'll put the nest. But sometimes there's more cover at the tips of the branches, and that's commonly the case in ponderosa habitat. And in those situations, the nests will be in those areas where there's more cover on the tree. And I mentioned that they are very specific. They have a lot of specific behaviors related to specific habitat types. So it's worth talking about what their habitat needs are and how they use these different habitats throughout the year. So they're classically considered and correctly considered pinyon juniper obligates. They are obligated to the pinyon pine. However, they use the edges of this habitat type and the transition zones between it and other habitat types fairly extensively. So the pinyon juniper woodlands are the most abundant forest type in the Western US, typically occurring from 3,000 to 9,000 feet, depending on your latitude and other conditions. And north of where the pinyon pine occurs, you get into a juniper monoculture, which is structured very similarly to pinyon juniper woodlands. So if you think back to those range maps I showed a few slides ago, north of where those pinyon pines occur, you have juniper, various species, a couple different species of juniper occur, and they function very similarly in terms of the structure they provide for the birds. So they're using this habitat with species like mountain chickadee and black-throated gray warblers and that kind of thing. They also use the sagebrush steppe. And every time I get to this slide, I realize I need to include sort of the open areas analogous to sagebrush steppe, because this doesn't necessarily apply throughout the range of the bird. Sometimes there is grassland adjacent to pinyon juniper woodland. Sometimes there is Joshua tree transition zone adjacent to pinyon juniper woodland. And then at the upper edge of it, sometimes it grades into ponderosa. But this slide is supposed to represent the open areas adjacent to the pinyon juniper woodlands. So distinct from valley floor salt desert, this is a slightly higher elevation shrub community occurring adjacent to the pinyon juniper woodlands. And it is analogous in some areas to grassland and other open habitat types. So it's not that they're necessarily tied to sagebrush specifically, it's the structure of the habitat that they're drawn to. But because there are a number of conservation priorities and cultural priorities associated with sagebrush steppe, it's worth highlighting that habitat type, that they do share this with sagebrush sparrow and sage thrasher and greater sage grouse, and they all co-occur in these habitats. They use ponderosa and Jeffrey pine woodland less often than pinyon juniper woodland, but this is possibly related to the availability on the landscape. If there is not significant pinyon juniper woodland nearby, they may be quite happy in ponderosa woodland. And we are still waiting to figure out how that works and what they eat and how that keeps them happy. But this is a habitat type extensively used by pinyon jays in Oregon and Arizona, and to a lesser degree in the Great Basin here in Nevada. To be quite honest, I don't know the degree to which they use ponderosa habitat in Colorado. And then, of course, the ecotone and edges that I was mentioning in all of the slides previously. So you can see in the photo there how the trees sort of grade into that open space, and they're farther apart from each other. It's not a closed canopy woodland, but there's still trees around. And it's this natural gradient between habitat types that forms a distinct habitat type of its own. And it's sort of this best of both worlds philosophy, and it has a very high diversity of wildlife of numerous species here, in addition to the bird species that co-occur with pinyon jays in this habitat type. Here are a few more examples of what that looks like. All of those are photos where I have seen Pinyon Jays before. The one on the lower right is a survey location that I survey regularly, almost every May. And every year without fail, I detect Pinyon Jays there, sometimes just flying by, but more often than not, they're perching in trees as they make their way through. And I don't know what they're doing there, if it's a historic site or if it's a traveling from a caching location to another area, but that wide open space is used extensively by the Pinyon Jays. Okay, so with all of that, we have a very cool bird, at least I think so. But beyond that, what's the point? And I think this is a little bit of a moot point at this point. I think you're all pretty well aware of the point here, why we care about Pinyon Jays. We're seeing large population declines. We're not totally sure why. The bird has a complex life history that challenges our ability to survey them and collect this information that we need. They have been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act, and the status of that happened in 2022, I think the petition was, and they're conducting the species status review, and it's scheduled to be completed in 2028. But as their 90-day review took just about a year, more than a year, who knows when this will actually happen. But they are investigating and conducting their reviews. And because of all these changing environmental conditions, population changes we're observing, there's a bit of pressure to figure out what's going on. And this chart on the right here was, I think this was late 2017 or 18, but this is breeding birds survey data. And the two lines, the upper and lower line, are sort of the confidence interval. And then in the middle is the estimated trend based on their point count data from breeding bird surveys. And so that is a pretty steep decline. At the time, steeper than any other songbird in the Western US. Not sure if that stat still holds true, but they are declining significantly. And while their populations are declining, there are a number of changes happening in the landscape they use, affecting the habitat structure. So in the top photo, you can see this infill of pinyon juniper woodlands. The stands are becoming more dense for a number of complicated reasons, but the long and short of it is that they are becoming more dense. There is the effects of decades and decades of wildfire suppression on the fire regime now. And so we're seeing frequent high intensity fires in pinyon juniper woodland, whereas that may not have always been the case. The effect of livestock and grazing, and then of course warmer, drier temperatures, and the expansion of pinyon juniper woodlands to lower elevations not previously occupied by that habitat type. And so we mentioned some of the unique challenges to research, but just to emphasize those, the large home range sizes are particularly problematic. We have mapped some birds using an area as big as 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. They have sometimes nomadic movements driven by resource availability or potentially other factors, so that they're not always where you expect them to be when you go to look for them. They occupy difficult terrain, very steep in cases, a lot of washes, difficult to see from one wash to the next, and to traverse that terrain to actually follow the birds when they pick up and fly from one location to the next is challenging. They actually have surprisingly secretive behaviors, despite being in these flocks of hundreds of individuals making noisy calls across the landscape. They can also be very secretive and difficult to find. And a lot of flocks are very weary of human presence. And this is not necessarily the case for all flocks, as I know there are a number of folks on this call can attest to the amount of birdseed they go through when the birds show up at their house and don't seem bothered at all by the presence of humans. But that's not the case for all flocks. There are a lot of wild birds that just don't behave that way and are remarkably difficult to get close to. In addition to all of that, there is variation to their annual patterns, day by day, year by year, and a lot of factors drive this. In the winter of 2017, GBBO put some radio transmitters on a couple of birds that we caught in this photo is the Pine Nut Mountains, which are just outside of Carson City, Nevada, to the east of Carson City, south of Reno. And so we put some radio transmitters on two birds in a flock there, and we collected the data shown in the image there. And with that, we realized that they were focusing a lot of their activity at the habitat edges. This is the flock that had a 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer home range, and it was very informative for this one flock. And it was a lot of work to get all of that information for one flock. And based on some of our previous work with the species, we learned that this was not exactly the same model that all flocks follow. There are a number of other flocks that we've observed that behave very differently. And just for reference in that photo there, the yellow lines are the flight paths, the red squares are polygons where the flock was actually foraging on the landscape, either caching on the ground or perching in trees or whatnot, but they were occupying an area, and that's outlined by those red polygons. And then the blue pins are single point locations of the birds. So because of all of this going on and these population declines that the breeding bird survey data was suggesting, Partners in Flight formed a working group. And Partners in Flight is a collaborative group of agency biologists and others from, there's a Western section, there's a world section, it's a worldwide conservation network. And within the Western section, they formed the Pinyon Jay Working Group, which is basically the world's experts on Pinyon Jays. And in these meetings, they developed this vision of a community science program, largely because of all of the reasons that I have been outlining. And so this army of volunteers philosophy to cover more ground and really leverage our capacity to collect data on these challenging but amazing birds. And so we developed the hub for Pinyon Jay community science. And it is an online database that displays all of the sightings submitted by volunteers, and it is freely available to all. On this website, we have training resources, survey tips, and background information about Pinyon Jays, and that QR code there can navigate you to that site if you're interested to explore it. And that effort was started in late 2021. And so on the left is what the screen looks like of the app that you use to collect the data. And then on the right is a screenshot that I took today of all of the data submitted to the program thus far. Recently, we added, and I'll leave most of the updates to John, but just because I was screenshotting the map, we did update the hub map so you can filter by time, and you can select, you can filter the survey results that you see based on those time bins there. And so the hub functions, it collects data and functions superficially very similar to eBird. And so on a certain level, one might ask, why not just harvest data from eBird? And that is for a few reasons. The eBird data is very useful and it's fantastic for a number of reasons, but it does not offer standardized absence points or behavior info and comments. So with our community science program, there's the ability to document absence points, which we have a protocol for when you're standing in one location for the certain amount of time, 10 minutes, and you don't detect birds and you are in appropriate habitat type, you can submit an absence record. And this is important because it is a 0 on the landscape rather than a gap in the data. When you look at eBird and you don't see a pin, it's sort of a question mark as to whether someone actually went there or nobody went there at all. And so with these 0s, we can say that there was an observer there in appropriate habitat and there were no Pinyon Jays there. And that information is very useful to us in developing models. Additionally, the big strength of this app is the link from behavior information to habitat type. So all of these records are geo-referenced to a specific location, And because of this habitat specific behaviors they engage in, we are able to then draw links between these behaviors and habitat types. With more and more data coming in, we can really learn what habitat types are mostly used for what behaviors. And it is designed to be flexible to encourage participation. So it can be used to whatever capacity is desired, really. You can systematically investigate potential Pinyon Jay habitat by going to these locations, and you can submit absence records when you don't see them. You can approach that area from a different access point the next time, and you can approach it in this systematic function to really figure out how the birds are using the landscape. Or you can use it as an opportunistic tool when you happen to be walking the dog. If you're in pinyon juniper habitat and you hear Pinyon Jays, you can just pull your phone out and submit a record to us of what those birds are up to. So it's really up to you how involved you want this process to be. Survey 123 is the name of the app. It is produced by Esri. And the way it works is our data collectors create a free community account on the Hub website, download the free app to your phone or tablet, let us know that you have created that community account, and we then add you to the team, and you can download the survey form to your phone. It will then work when you do or don't have reception. You just remember to submit those forms from the outbox when you come back to reception. But when you submit through the app, all of the data is automatically transmitted to that map I showed a few slides ago, and that map populates in real time with those observations. So if you're interested in participating, you can scan that QR code, you sign up for that free community account, and then you email us with that username to become a data collector. Once we get that email, we can add you to the team, and then you are good to go. And when you are collecting data with the app, the main thing that we are focusing on is the behavior that the birds are engaged in. There are a number of fields that are all pretty straightforward and self-explanatory as to the number of birds, how far away from you they were, the direction they were. When you select presence, you get all of these behavior fields. And if you select absence, they don't pop up. So so first we have flying over and flying locally, and I just want to highlight the distinction between these two. Flying over being when the birds are not using the landscape where you are, they're flying high overhead, just traveling through. Flying locally is when there are birds flying from tree to tree, and they are actually using the landscape that you are in, using that location. So the difference between moving from A to B and actually using the area where you are. And before I move from that, that is sort of another thing with eBird, is that the vast majority of Pinyon Jay reports to eBird are birds flying over, and it's not always specified. And so it's hard to read value into those points when we don't really know what was going on and what that point meant to the Pinyon Jays. So accordingly, the vast majority of observations submitted to us are of birds flying over. And that is sort of just the way it goes. That's how that happens a lot. But ideally, we are looking to collect more information, and we are looking to document birds using the landscape and to categorize the behaviors that they're engaged in while they are in those areas of the landscape. So flying over and flying locally are both behavior options that can be selected. Foraging is another behavior type that we have identified. So there is no distinction between forage items. There's not a different option to select if they're harvesting nuts or if they're eating insects and juniper berries. But there is a distinction between foraging on the ground or shrubs versus foraging in trees. And there is a distinction between foraging and caching. So when the birds are on the ground, it can be difficult to tell if they're caching or retrieving caches or if they're foraging for insects. So when you see birds on the ground, it's worth paying a little more attention and being very careful and seeing if you can tell what exactly they're up to. And these are all situations where you would add comments onto that survey form. because whatever you observe that you can't capture with the data fields we have provided, you can add in those comments. This is all still developing, and these comments are still informing future updates to the survey form. So the more we learn from your comments, the better we can make this form. Additionally, we added a new form last year, which I won't talk too much about now, but we do have a form to count pine cones, which of course are the most important food resource of the bird. So this form is available to followers of the initiative. It's available on the hub site and through Survey 123. You can only do these surveys in the fall when there are ripe cones on the trees. We don't want people counting cones in the off season because that doesn't necessarily relate to that year's production of cones. And we have ways that characterize the productivity of the pinyon pines in the plot, and we are interested in mature cones for this season, as opposed to older cones that may still be persisting on the branches. So mainly including this slide to let folks know that this pine cone counting form exists, and we are going to do more trainings on that later in the year as we approach cone season. Resting in trees is another behavior type that we have identified that occurs in specific habitat types. So this refers to birds that are perching in trees, but not necessarily at a roost site. And their behavior does not indicate they're up to anything else otherwise. They oftentimes just need to rest, and you will see them enjoying the shade beneath the canopy of the trees during the day. So resting in trees is an important behavior of theirs, and protecting the habitat that they use that for is important as well. Caching or retrieving caches. So again, we're not drawing distinctions between whether the birds are placing caches or whether they're retrieving nuts from caches. We just want to know that they are visiting a cache site. What that form tells us is that that location is valuable for caching. So it's not always easy to see birds transporting nuts, but sometimes it is. And it's not always easy to see what they're up to on the ground. So a lot of this just takes careful observation. And that photo there is more typically the spacing I see when birds are at a cache site. They're not shoulder to shoulder right next to each other, but they are very close to each other nonetheless, just a little more spread out. And you can see that sandy soil, there's a lot of open space on the ground. The shrubs aren't too close together. And I believe that was a south-facing slope. So all of that is pretty typical of a caching site. Nesting and confirmed breeding. So we do have upcoming updates to the survey form, and they mostly relate to this activity type. So we currently have nesting or active nest as an activity type to select, and that leaves out a lot of breeding behaviors. And we do feel that it's important to document those breeding behaviors. So that will be coming at some point in the near future. Where you'll select that option, and then there'll be a drop down of behavior types below that to be a little more specific about what was actually observed. Just because of the number of behaviors that can confirm breeding, it's not just about nests. However, the nest sites are typically in areas with denser cover than caching sites, and that's important to note that they are using patches of trees that are more dense than on average across the landscape, and at slightly higher elevations than the rest of their home range. And these areas are not easy to find. They are notoriously quiet at their nesting sites. But it is very important to document these behaviors when you see them. And also very important to note how disturbance sensitive pinyon jays are on the nest. If a nest predator were to find one nest, the entire colony is very vulnerable because of that spacing of nests. And so pinyon jays will abandon their nests at the slightest disturbance if there's too many humans visiting the colony, or if a human visiting were to draw a nest predator's attention to the nests, the colony is basically as good as gone. So very sensitive around the nesting sites, but a very important habitat type to keep in mind. Roosting is another very habitat specific behavior, and it refers to the location where the jays have spent the night. So the birds in that photo are not roosting. That would be an example of birds resting in trees. But roosting habitats are similar to nesting habitat in that they're denser woodland at slightly higher elevations than the rest of the home range, sometimes on slopes, but areas that are concealed and offer cover. Visiting feeder was a behavior that we added after the form was initially released because we realized the value of noting wild flocks and provisioned flocks. I mentioned earlier that they behave differently in and around humans and neighborhoods than they do out in more rural and remote areas. So it's still unclear the degree to which they use feeders and how that factors into their annual cycle. If they're using it to supplement low pine nut years, if it's easier for them and they're just settling in areas adjacent to development in urban areas. But it's interesting to note the things that happen when they visit these feeders is that they come into contact with humans more, and there are opportunities for collisions with vehicles, and they're encountering roads, and they're encountering cats and dogs and whatever else. They're finding starlings, and the starlings are following them back to their caching locations. So it's valuable information for us to know when the birds are visiting a feeder, because we're still learning what that all means for the rest of their biology. The last behavior category we have is unsure, and that is when you see birds doing something that you are unable to identify. These birds were photographed by a Reno volunteer, Alan Taqueros, and it seems like they're eating paint chips, and that is most likely in preparation for nesting season because of the calcium content of those paint chips. And so they will need that calcium to be producing eggshells. So that's possibly what's going on in that photo. Otherwise, I totally speculate a guess. But that's the last behavior type we have identified, and we feel that it is important to be as specific as possible when recording these behaviors. So that's why I wanted to emphasize and highlight what these all looked like, and that the more specific you're able to be, the better. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John, who is going to talk about what's up next.
Thank you, Ned. You hear me okay? I'm going to have you continue to advance the slides. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk for a relatively brief period of time, mainly focusing on what we plan to do with all of this community science data. It's a question that gets asked often, and it's a very reasonable one. We didn't ask everyone to go to all this trouble or go to the trouble to set this up just to create a nice map to look at as time goes by, but we have some specific plans. I want to preface a description of what those plans are, though, in two ways. One is that, as I'm sure you can imagine, the plans that I'm going to talk about were based on agreements and contracts with certain funding agencies and certain partners. And it is unclear to all of us at this point in time whether all of this will proceed the way it was planned, or whether certain resources will not be available after all, and we'll have to regroup and replan. But I'm going to describe all of this in a hopeful fashion as if things proceed along the lines that were established in months past. So that is one caveat. The other one is that I think it's helpful for those of you who follow Pinyon Jay news and events and happenings more broadly than just with regard to the community science project. I think it's helpful to provide you with a little bit of context about the community science project. There are several established ways to count Pinyon Jays. Community science program is one of them. Other ones that you may hear about and have the potential to be confused by if you're not clear on the distinctions, are the survey protocols that have been developed by the National Pinyon Jay Working Group for more, let's just call it rigorous research or traditionally rigorous research applications, and they're usually conducted by paid seasonal technicians. We'll call that for shorthand, we'll just call that the formal survey protocols, and there's 2 or 3 versions of that that exist at different places around the range. The community science survey protocol is it's a streamlined version of that that's easier for volunteers with a range of available time and a range of different training backgrounds to conduct. It records much of the same information, but they're not exactly the same thing. So before I describe all of this, I just want to make sure that you're aware of the fact that there is more than one survey protocol out there and that they all have their niches and their purposes and their rationales. So for the Community Science Project, which GBBO administers and established essentially at the request of a number of partners who we worked with, specifically from a few Audubon societies initially, we have the following 3 goals for that data set. One is to create improved versions of distributional and trend analysis that are better in some respects from what's currently available. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. A second and related thing we want to be able to help facilitate with the community science data set is to investigate habitat use in a more behaviorally specific way than is typically possible with the data sets that have been used to date for the most part, and to be able to examine how those patterns might vary by geography in the Southwest versus the Great Basin versus the Colorado Plateau. And then finally, a goal for this data set is to investigate how home ranges change throughout the annual cycle with the seasons and how consistent they are year over year. This is the kind of data that is often not collected in the more professional protocols, which typically occur only during the breeding season. So let me go to the next slide, please, Ned, and let me talk a little bit more about all of this. The plan for the distributional trend analysis is for it to occur during this year and the following year, and to be done in collaboration with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. More specifically, as you know, the Cornell Lab is responsible for the eBird data set and the world experts in using that to model population changes and distributions. But as Ned hit upon several times, there are limitations to that eBird data set for this specific species. It doesn't allow us to easily remove from consideration all of the different places that Pinyon Jays fly over, but may not actually use. And being able to focus our models on the places they use could be a critical factor in ensuring that we develop the correct conservation targets as specifically and as accurately as possible. Additionally, eBird data does not allow us to easily distinguish whether a given record involves birds that are nesting in a particular location versus caching in a particular location versus gathering pine nuts in a particular location. So between us and Cornell, we both saw tremendous advantages in combining the behavioral specificity of this community science program with the sheer volume and reach and precedent of using eBird data to understand bird populations. So the plan is to combine those 2 things for Pinyon Jays and to proceed along the lines that's outlined in this particular paper to model habitat use, the distribution of Pinyon Jays, and and perhaps even what their trends might be. Right now, as we speak, there are about 4,000 records in the Pinyon Jay Community Science data set. Assuming, of course, this all goes forward as planned, it would be an excellent goal for the volunteer base and the whole team of contributors to get that up to, I think Ned and I discussed this. I think we decided to set a goal of maybe 7,500 records by the end of this year. I might be off by 500 or so. We're going to announce that on the hub site, what our goal is sometime soon. But any of you who've been contributing to this data set or were thinking about contributing, there really is a end purpose towards trying to get as many records in as many places as we can to make the outcome of this collaborative analysis as informative and as robust as it can be. Next slide, Neb. A related but slightly different undertaking will be the behaviorally specific habitat use by geography. Some of that will be captured in the collaborative Cornell analysis that I talked about, but we can drill down deeper. I'm seeing a question pop up about how 75 was determined. There's nothing magic about that number. It's not the result of some sort of power analysis. It's what we think is a realistic but semi-ambitious goal for the user base that we currently have within the course of a year. If we can get more, that would be great. If we had to stick with 4,000, it would certainly still be a useful undertaking, but we wanted to identify a number that would give people a target and be potentially achievable and would represent a significant improvement in the number of data records that we currently have. So that's the best answer I can give you for the specific number of 7,500, Ashley. So moving on to this second goal, I want to explain these busy looking box charts over to the right a little bit because they help to quantify what Ned was getting at in some of his earlier comments, and they form the rationale for this specific use of the community science data set. So for the sake of argument, let's just pick out, there are 9 boxes in the right-hand side of this slide, and let's pick out one of them to focus on for right now, specifically the one called tree cover, which is halfway down from the top and in the leftmost column. And within that box, you see 4 horizontally oriented rectangles that have little whiskers and points going off to either side of them. Going from top to bottom, those represent locations where caching behaviors were observed in Nevada. CA on the left-hand side is how that's coded. The next one down is where foraging behaviors were observed, labeled F. The next one down is where nesting evidence or nesting locations were observed. And finally, the bottom one is a random sample of all the available locations within these study areas. So you can see at the bottom sort of the range of different tree cover percentages that exist on the landscape. The little line in the middle of that rectangle represents sort of a median value, and you can see the range of values that exist all the way from 0 on the left up to, it looks like that might be 60% or so on the far right. Now, if we look at what Pinyon Jays are actually using for these 3 different behavior types, you will see a couple of things. First, the average or the median tree cover that characterize caching sites is far lower than the tree cover that characterizes foraging sites, which is lower still than the tree cover that characterizes nesting sites. Ned's described some of this before. And if you look at these various boxes, of the other 8 boxes there, you'll see that for the most part, similar patterns of behaviorally specific habitat partitioning occur with regard to other attributes of the environment as well, like elevation, slope, the age of the stand, the tree stand, and several others that are shown there as well. What does that mean and why is that important to know? Well, if our data set just says Pinyon Jays were here without referencing which of those things they were doing, you'll see that we're basically mushing up a bunch of variability into a generic occurrence point. When you do that, you get distributional maps that show the probability of occurrence, like the one on the left. Now, those are great products. There's nothing in the world wrong with them. But because it's not distinguishing between the kinds of habitat these birds use for very different things, it only goes so far in telling us the parts of the landscape that are important to these birds, and particularly telling us where all of these different finer grained habitat requirements occur close enough together to satisfy the needs of a resident flock. So in other words, without accounting for this variability that's associated with different Pinyon Jay activity types, our understanding of habitat needs and habitat use will always hit sort of an upper limit of resolution. By using data sets like the community science data set, where behavior types are specified, we can add an element or a dimension of behavior type into these models that will really create a next generation of understanding habitat needs and the distribution of these birds. And furthermore, will enable us to look at how those patterns might vary from place to place. We think this is critical because, again, the question that's being asked is, okay, everybody's finally realized, somewhat belatedly, that this is a seriously declining species. And in many quarters, people want to do something about it. Whether that something will be an effective solution or not depends on the quality of the information upon which that decision is based. And our feeling is that community science can make a huge contribution by ensuring that our understanding of habitat needs is as nuanced as it can be for this bird whose very natural history is highly nuanced. So that was the second one. Let's move to the final application of community science data in the next slide that we have on the radar screen. Ned, can you do the next slide, please?
Trying, sorry. What happened?
If for some reason it won't advance, let me know. I can just talk about it. That's not really a problem.
Shoot, there we go.
There
Sorry
we go.
for that.
Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I had a follow-up slide on topic number 2, which is that there are lots of precedents now for using citizen science or community science data in conjunction with more structured surveys like the working group survey protocol data that I talked about earlier to create the best possible models and outcomes. And in this undertaking, we're going to ensure that those modern approaches to making the best use of community science data are indeed leveraged. Okay, so now we'll go on to the third topic. Okay, the third topic is to try to understand better the seasonal variation in habitat use and habitat requirements that Pinyon Jay flocks exhibit, and the extent to which home ranges are consistent from year to year. Why is this important? Well, I'll give you our perspective on this. This is an emerging topic, an emerging area of discussion. But with songbirds, when we hear that a species is declining, oftentimes our first inclination is to think it must have something to do with loss of breeding habitat, or perhaps factors that reduce breeding success, or increased nest predation, things along those lines, things that focus on the nesting season. And certainly there could be some of that going on with pinyon jays. But if you think about the kind of like the standard situation that leads us to that default expectation, it's that with songbirds, we're usually dealing with migratory species. They have relatively small breeding territories and home ranges. They go somewhere else for the remainder of the year. So it stands to reason that if a bird is declining based on its experience here in our area, that the breeding season might be the bottleneck. It might have something to do with it. Pinyon jays have to live in their home ranges all year round. And it's an open question whether the factors that are driving their declines are factors that affect their breeding success or factors that affect some other phase of their life history. I'll say my favorite explanation, hypothesis, is that these are birds that have to survive the winter. They survive the winter on stored food, and all of the data and all of the anecdotal observations that have accrued so far suggest in one form or another that the likelihood that pinyon pines will produce a crop of pine nuts in a given year is lower than it once was. And if they are producing them, they're producing fewer. So it's at least plausible that the bottleneck with pinyon jays doesn't occur in their breeding season, but occurs with regard to their ability to store enough food to support a flock of a given size throughout a winter when there is no other food source. If that's the case, then understanding their home ranges throughout the year is important. We might be missing some important piece of the puzzle if we focus only on the breeding season. So as a way to start that process, we've piloted a elaboration of the community science protocol that we call Adopt a Trail, specifically with Audubon Southwest down in Arizona and New Mexico. And we're more than willing to do something similar with other groups that have an interest. The idea here is that rather than just going out whenever it's convenient and collecting opportunistic observations, volunteers will literally adopt a defined trail, and they will survey that trail for pinyon jays at least every quarter over the course of 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. That will give us a sense of how pinyon jay presence on the landscape and use of the landscape might shift as the seasons progress, and how consistent it is from year to year. Ned, I think there's a slide after that one that illustrates that. So yes, there's on the hub site that Ned has talked about, there is, for some users, they see a tab on that hub site that leads them into the section that covers Adopt a Trail. You guys probably wouldn't see it at this point because it's only shared with people who are part of this program, but it basically looks like this. It shows the trails that people can adopt, and there's a modified version of the Survey 123 form that they use to record observations of pinyon jays multiple times over the course of 1 or more years. So that is our plans for the community science data set. I think they're substantial. I think they can potentially make a real contribution to this emerging palette of pinyon jay conservation measures that are being actively discussed right now. And I think with that, we come up to the last 15 minutes or so of the allotted time, and Ned and I are more than happy to answer questions about anything we've discussed or about things that we did not have time to get into based on what you're interested in hearing about. So thank you, everybody.
And thank you, John and Ned, very much. And it looks like we have at least one question that hasn't already been answered from Van. So, so the question is, so we need more 100 to 200-year-old pinyon stands between 6,000 to 7,000 feet in elevation with a density covering about 25% of the ground.
That would be that the figure that I showed wasn't intended to suggest that you need to go those places. Ideally, your efforts and the efforts of all your colleagues would cover a range of different environmental conditions, because that's what allows us to distinguish the best between good habitat and bad habitat. As an example, if we only sent people to places that we knew were good habitat, our ability to develop the statistical models that allow us to understand what in fact is good and to refine those are weakened. So don't consider yourself limited to the places that figure or others suggest are the best habitat. Obviously, if you're going out there to do Pinyon Jay community science, you will want to go to places that are plausible locations. So you wouldn't want to go to places above, say, 8,500 feet or below 5,000 feet, or places where the nearest coniferous tree is 40 miles away or something like that. So, anywhere is fair game as long as it's, in the range of plausible habitat. If CFO or individuals would like suggestions about places that we think would be particularly promising to focus your efforts, that's something that can be developed, and that we would, the only way to do that in the most meaningful way for Colorado would be to hear from folks with Colorado expertise who know Colorado management needs, and then we can happily listen to that and sort of help to steer volunteer efforts toward the places that are the most useful. We can make generalized suggestions, but without that state-specific expertise, it would not be necessarily an optimized way to direct effort. So if that's of interest, we're happy to discuss that with you guys in more detail.
Great. And, speaking of contacting too, so kind of a little bit up on the chat, Ned has dropped in the URL for the Community Science Project. If you want to copy that link, take a look at it, as well as Ned and John's contact information. I'm going to also drop into the chat the CFO page about this Pinyon Jay Community Science Project that we've been trying to keep it updated. It talks about how you can volunteer, going into the survey 1, 2, 3, kind of the step-by-step. I suspect it probably is the same thing on the Great Basin Bird Observatory link as well. So that we can start getting folks involved who haven't already been involved. I have a couple more here. If you want to hang with us, David is asking, are there any radio tagged jays that could be detected by a MODIS network station?
I'm not personally aware of tagging projects right now, specific ones that are aimed at MODIS specific monitoring stations, but I would not be surprised if some of that has developed in some areas. I know that there's a number of graduate student telemetry projects out there. I'm just not really up on which ones were perhaps designed with MODIS particularly in mind. Ned, are you aware of?
No, I'm not necessarily, no.
David, if you want more information on that, it's easy to reach Scott Summershoe from the Pinyon Jay working group through the working group's website, and or one of us can provide you with contact info. And he really is more up than anyone I know on the latest and greatest with the telemetry projects that are out there right now with Pinyon Jays. So if that's of real interest, I would contact him or ping one of us, and we're happy to hook you up with him for more.
I think a lot of it is with cell tags more than MODIS.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Most of the telemetry work we did on Pinyon Jays a number of years ago was just VHF.
Okay, we have one other question here, or one comment actually, from Sally Waterhouse, who's saying, can John or Ned comment again on the importance of not disturbing nesting areas simply by your presence? So if you want to go a little bit more into that, if folks are going to be participating in this community science project.
That's an
Yeah,
important. Go ahead,
absolutely.
Ned. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, totally. Your presence can have much more impact than you realize when you're there, in terms of not just disturbing the birds by simply stressing them by being there, but also by the potential nest predators and parasites that you're leading to that colony. So it's really easy as an observer to be, if you're walking along and you happen to find a nest, it's very easy to inadvertently lead a nest predator to that nest by stopping right at the tree where the nest is and looking at it and shoving your hand in there to take a picture. And then you turn around and walk away. And what you have just done is left a dead end scent trail right to that nest tree that's very easily followed by any predator that operates on its mainly olfactory senses, or coyotes, or whatever else, skunks, raccoons, whatever, squirrels, other nest predators like that. But also when you're out there moving through the landscape, nest predators like other corvids, ravens will follow you to nests. Ravens have been remarkable in their ability to learn what sage grouse surveyors are doing when they're holding their antennae up, they're trying to track a sage grouse to a nest. The ravens, in some cases, have actually started following these observers to sage grouse nests. So they can very easily watch your behavior. They can see what you're looking at, what you're focused on. And if you lead a raven to a Pinyon Jay colony, it's pretty easy for that raven to find all of the other nests after they have found the first nest. So there's a lot of things going on with nest colonies, and it's really important to be very, very careful and to tread lightly when you think you might be near nesting Pinyon Jays.
Yeah, and
Hopefully-
we recommend, and the working group has a number of recommendations for minimizing those impacts. But suffice it to say that unless you have the appropriate training and a specific reason to approach or enter a nesting colony, you should not do it. And even if you do have the training and a specific purpose, the timing is important too. The sensitivity to disturbance tends to be higher in the early breeding season. So the message to the community science folks is that your task is not to enter or even closely approach a breeding colony and try to find nests while they're occupied. But documenting that there is a location out there 400 meters from you in the northwest direction that has evidence of breeding is very useful and very important. If you are a kind of a skilled observer and you're interested in Pinyon Jay nests, you could always go back after the breeding season is over and knock around in the breeding colony and look for some of the stick nests and that sort of thing. But please resist any temptation to do that while breeding's actually occurring.
I just pasted a link into the chat of one of those resources from the working group.
Thanks, Nip.
And I think that is it for the questions. Once again, I want to thank so much to John and Ned. We greatly appreciate your time for updating us on what is going on with this project. I want to let folks know that this recording will be uploaded to the Colorado Field Ornithologist YouTube channel to go back to. I highly encourage you to look at the links that Ned has dropped in there to connect a little bit further. Plus, as I mentioned, I dropped into the chat the CFO page on this project as well. And I suspect our conservation committee is going to be working with Great Basin Bird Observatory on some of these new aspects, the cone count, the adopt a trail, and get that word out to our members and our followers on our social media. And Ned, yeah, you just made a comment. February through April is probably the most sensitive time, but it does vary with weather conditions. Absolutely.
There was a question about specific months. So again, my experience is mostly Nevada, Great Basin, but I suspect it's fairly similar.
And thank you. And any last thoughts from either of you?
No, just thanking everyone for their contributions. We really, really appreciate all that effort and just highlighting the value of it. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending, and we're always eager to hear more from you and make the experience as productive and enjoyable for everybody as we can.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work. We greatly appreciate it. And more than ever, we need folks to get involved and participate and help out this very important species to all of us on this Zoom. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the night. And we'll be chatting soon again.
Thanks, everybody.